Okay, so welcome back to the Museo Storico Aeronautica Militare here at Lake Bracciano, 1 hour to the north of Rome. Now I'm standing in front of the Savoia-Marchetti 79, or in short, the SM-79. Now this is an aircraft that the Italians started producing in the 1930s. In 1934, the first prototype flew and it was envisioned to be a passenger plane with 8 passengers as a full load. Now in 1936, this aircraft was already integrated into the Italian Air Force as a bomber. Now at that point in time, this aircraft was one of the fastest machines or even aircraft out there, and that includes the single-engine aircraft. It could go, or the prototype could go at roughly 410 kilometers an hour, and that for quite a long time. So this was, in a sense, the ideal frame or the ideal design for a bomber at that point in time. Now from its design, the Sparviero, which translates to Sparrowhawk, was of course a long-wing tri-motor. Now the fuselage itself was constructed with a tubular steel frame, which was in the front part covered with duralumin, which is essentially a very lightweight metal. In the top part, you also had a combination of duralumin and plywood, whereas the rest of the aircraft was essentially covered in fabric. And the wings were made out of plywood, of course, as well. Now, the engines that this aircraft used went through a couple of iterations. The first main production variant of the S-79 had the Alfa Romeo 126 RC34, which produced roughly 780 horsepower. Now, since you had 3 of them, you had quite a respectable power output, and the aircraft could go roughly 430 kilometers an hour. Now, later on, and I believe this very version actually has the upgraded engines, you would get the Alfa Romeo 128, and that engine had an output of around about 1000 horsepower, bringing this aircraft up to a total of 3000 horsepower, which allowed it to go roughly 475 kilometers an hour. Now, the first use of the Sparviero as a bomber was, of course, during the Spanish Civil War. And here the top speed and the range of the SM-79 really made it a worthwhile asset. The aircraft itself was usually faster than most fighter planes of that era, and only a few planes like the I-16 could actually catch these aircraft in flight when they were going at their top speed. However, the I-16 didn't have the firepower to really bring these aircraft down, so the SM-79 was one of the most invulnerable in apostrophes aircraft of the war, of the Spanish Civil War. Now, as a bomber, the SM-79 did have to load its bombs vertically and not horizontally, which means that it could load up to 12 50 or 100 kilogram bombs, 5 250 kilogram bombs, but only 2 500 kilogram bombs. However, for the time that we are talking here in the 1930s, this is actually quite a respectable bomb load. Now, it had a crew of 5 or 6, and it was armed with 3 Breda 12.7 machine guns, essentially a 50 cal. Now, 2 of those were essentially defensive weapons, one in the top and one in the ventral part of the aircraft. And these were pointing, of course, rearwards. Now, you did have that strange idea that the Italians have of mounting a fixed Breda 12.7 millimeter facing forward. This was apparently extremely unpopular and was also not really used by the pilots, and most Sparvieros actually dismounted the weapon or substituted it with one of a lower caliber. Now, the aircraft also had 2 Breda 7.7 millimeter machine guns in the side that could be used for defense. Now, even though the Sparviero had a good bomb load for 1930 standards, in the 1940s, when World War II was in full swing, the Italians started to realize that it wasn't really up to par and found new ways of using the Sparviero. Now, of course, the location of Italy makes control of the Mediterranean extremely important. So the idea was put forward of mounting torpedoes. And this started happening in 1939, when the Italians started to practice or test the validity of mounting torpedoes on the Sparviero. Now, they first tried it with 1 torpedo and then later with 2. But they've noticed that with two torpedoes mounted to the aircraft, the handling really suffered. So the general recommendation to the squadrons that later received torpedoes was to just use 1. Now, the torpedo they used was a British design, and had a warhead of roughly 170 kilograms, which was pretty respectable for a aviation or an aircraft carrier torpedo. Now, starting in August 1940, the Italians started to use this configuration, the Sparviero with a torpedo, in operational missions. Initially, they didn't really knew how to use these weapons. This was completely new to them. They didn't practice a lot. They didn't really have the occasion to practice a lot, and it was essentially learned by doing. Now, the first success they had with this weapon took them about a month of continuous missions, and it was a very, let's say, limited success in the way that only a few Sparvieros were used every mission, so the hit ratio was already quite low from the start. However, with these torpedoes, they did manage to inflict a pretty good hit on HMS Kent in September 1940, which essentially put the heavy cruiser out of action for 1 year. Now, the problem with the Sparviero and the torpedoes was that even though the torpedo had an effective or a maximum range of 3 kilometers, the probability of a hit at that range was incredibly small. So usually Sparvieros would get as close as 1,000 meters or even 500 meters before they dropped one of those torpedoes. And these aircraft, even though they weren't really the lightest or the most unprotected aircraft out there, did suffer quite substantially against Allied anti-aircraft fire. And when you had concentrated anti-aircraft fire coming from a big fleet, these machines and their crews paid a price. Now, between 1940 and 1942, the Italians used in ever-increasing number the Sparvieros as torpedo bombers, and they did achieve some credible success on the tactical level, but on the strategic level it just wasn't enough. Now, by 1942 and definitely by 1943, the Sparviero was really starting to show its age. The airframe itself was, of course, a 1930s design, and the aircraft that was supposed to replace the Sparviero, the SM-84, let's just say that it didn't really work out. The Italians had more problems with the upgrade or the substitution of the Sparviero than they had with the Sparviero. So they instead focused on maintaining the Sparvieros in their squadrons and essentially halted the production of the SM-84. Now, the problem here is, of course, that now you have a 1930s designed aircraft that is in a total war, and as I said, by 1942, by 1943, the limitations of this aircraft were obvious to everybody. And the problem was also that the airframe itself, it wasn't really suitable to be upgraded. They couldn't really change a lot with it to keep it in the game. So it was kept past its expiry date for quite a substantial amount of time. Now, in 1943, of course, there's the armistice, and Italy essentially draws out of World War II, with the south more or less fighting with the Allies, and the north, which is still controlled by the Wehrmacht and the Germans, still fighting on the side of the Axis. Now, the Allies, when they got their hands on the Sparvieros after the armistice, were not exactly impressed with the aircraft, and they didn't really use it. They had better machines that could get the job done. So they used these aircraft sometimes as transport or logistic airplanes. The North, however, the one that was still controlled by the Axis, continued to use the Sparvieros in operational missions as torpedo bombers and as bombers. Of course, by this time, the Allied fighters were essentially making mincemeat out of the Sparvieros every time they happened to find a pair of them. And the dropout and the casualty rate of these crews and aircraft was incredibly high. However, the SM-79 continued its service right up until the end of the war, and Italy, in fact, decommissioned its last Sparvieros in 1952. However, in some parts of the world, some of these machines were still used for a couple of years beyond that. Now, sadly, the Sparviero suffers from a bad reputation, which is largely based upon the performance that it had in the mid and late war period of World War II. However, when you look at this aircraft, you should always remember that it was pretty much a trendsetter in the 1930s, that it was an exceptionally good machine for the time, and that it was simply used beyond its expiration date, and that the Italians simply had nothing that could substitute it, so they were forced to continue using this aircraft. Now, before we end this episode, there should be really one thing that is mentioned, and that is that when the German pilots were flying side by side with the Italians on their missions across the Mediterranean, they always commented on the bravery of the Italian crews, essentially saying that If they themselves were forced to fly in a machine like this, through the dense AA and through the fighter cover of the Allied convoys, they themselves would probably not want to do it. So these guys, these Italian pilots that flew in the Sparvieros into combat with the torpedoes, really should be remembered as some of the bravest pilots out there in World War II. So I hope that you enjoyed this look at the SM-79, the Sparviero, and that you learned something from it. Now I want to thank the Museo Storico Aeronautica Militaria here in Italy for essentially maintaining this aircraft and for having this great collection that they have. The museum is free, so if you happen to be in the area, you should definitely give it a go. Now, if you want to see more of this kind of content, and if you want to support my channel, please check out my Patreon, because every little contribution helps me in getting these kind of videos into your living room. As always, I hope you guys have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.